right. Hello, one and all. Dr. Dan Miller on the 250 River with Dr. Dan. We're going to do the top 5 from 250 years ago this week, which ends January 29th for us. And we'll be looking at the week of January 29th, 1776. This is episode 60. I've got my cup of coffee in one of my favorite mugs. I've got my pen in hand, and I've got the old clipboard here in the lap. So we are ready to go. And I want to thank this week's sponsor of episode 60, which is the Drum's Head Tavern in downtown Philadelphia 250 years ago. Thank you for today's sponsorship. If you're in the market for a pleasing tankard of ale, perhaps a tasty meal any time of the day, and we have to say, if you're interested in joining the Pennsylvania Navy, get your sweet self down to the Drum's Head Tavern as soon as possible and sample the one, enjoy the second, and sign up for the third. Again, that's the Pennsylvania Navy, not the Continental Navy, is going to be recruiting you out of the Drum's Head Tavern 250 years ago today. Thank you for your sponsorship, the Drum's Head. We are top 5ing, so this is the deal. When you go to our Redux entry for today, and I really would invite you to do that, there's some really interesting stuff there, historically and from a leadership perspective. The theme you're going to see is big on big. We got to go big. We got to go big. We've tried to not. We've not had the means to, but we got to go big on big. That's the theme. Overarching, and we'll see a little bit how that comes into play here. But for number 5 right now, we're going to be talking for a couple of minutes about, I think, something new in the scholarship of the American Revolution and of 1776 and 75, that era, and so on. And it's what I'm calling the Harbor War. If you live in a seaside community or in a port town or in a harbor town in 250 years ago, your life is uniquely vulnerable and uniquely at risk, because you can not only find warfare and disorder and violence coming off of the land side of the world, but also the seaside, the water side of the world too, primarily from British ships that can bombard your community with very little notice and with very little care as to what type of damage is done. You're subject to kidnapping, hostage taking, wholesale destruction, oftentimes set by fires that the artillery barrage can start, and on and on. The Harbor War is a really important and real part of what's going on 250 years ago. And specifically this week, Charles Lee has been sent to New York City by George Washington. General Charles Lee, sent by General George Washington, with the idea of let's start organizing the defenses of the harbor community of New York City, because sooner or later we've got good intel, the British are headed your way, and you got to get ready. So Charles Lee will help you pull that together. He'll help you get started on that. Lee sends a letter, and this is the letter I wanted to emphasize for number 5 today. Lee's letter to the New York Committee of Safety, kind of the head honchos of the local resistance to the British. In that letter, Lee says, we've got to understand that there could be a benefit to having the destruction of your town. Strategically, there could be a real benefit, and a counter advantage, a disadvantage that the British don't see. So if they want to destroy it, it might not be the world's worst thing to have this town destroyed. Now, I'm saying it in those words. He's a little different in that, but where normally Charles Lee is depicted as kind of a villain in the American Revolution, this letter at this moment reveals him to be a really creative, kind of geopolitical military thinker at this point in time. And honestly, when I first read this letter and put it in this week's Redux, because that's where it goes chronologically, I started thinking about Pearl Harbor in 1941. It's an early version of the geopolitical thinking about, if the enemy strikes this area, it's not the world's worst thing. So, interesting there. Here's your leadership question out of number 5. Can you, as a leader, bring a fresh angle to a current problem? Can you, as a leader, bring a fresh angle to a current problem? not necessarily talking about with the same scale and implications of what Lee's referencing, but I think it's a good crack open of the door to ask yourself that question. How effective am I at offering a fresh angle on an old take? Number 4 in the top 5, humanity. Humanity in quotation marks. That's the name signed at the bottom of a letter written to John Adams 250 years ago this week. No other pen name, no other author. The writer calls him or herself humanity. And in the letter written to Massachusetts delegate to the Continental Congress, John Adams, humanity basically points out the obvious contradiction of the colonists wanting liberty while denying liberty to their enslaved black men, women, and children, and points out the ridiculousness of this, the hypocrisy, and all the rest. Here's why, in addition to the inherent quality of that point, why I've got it on the top, why I've got it at number 4. It's purposely misspelled, it's purposely bad English, it's purposely horribly written in terms of grammar and style and everything else you can imagine. Oddly, the word humanity is spelled correctly. A word of that size, number of syllables, and of its sophistication is nowhere to be found in the rest of this. It's purposely mimicking an uneducated person's attempt to communicate. I don't know. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know why the person wrote it. I just find that a really interesting thing from 250 years ago right now is humanity, and not only the content but the style of the letter written to John Adams. Here's my leadership question for you for number 4. Is there a basic contradiction that absolutely demands your attention as a leader? This is an obvious contradiction, right? We're demanding liberty on the one hand, we're denying it on the other. It's an obvious contradiction. Do you have one in your leadership, on your team, among your followers? Is there a basic contradiction you absolutely must tackle or address or bring to the surface? That's leadership question number 4. Number 3 on our rank, Melker Brobeck. Melker Brobeck is a German immigrant who lives near the town of Frederick, Maryland. Melker Brobeck has made a decision that he's going to join the 1st Maryland Continental Regiment. He's going to join the 9th Company, and in doing so, he specifically sets himself apart to join what's called the Light Infantry Company. Every regiment was supposed to have primarily infantry with one special unit attached known as the Light Infantry. They were the ones who functioned with speed and shock and surprise, who basically acted as irregulars, as guerrillas, as kind of Native American style warfare, which meant not lines, not just stand and point and load and point and fire and point and all the other kinds of things you think about from standard conventional warfare of that period. No, they're out in the woods and they're hiding and they're moving and they're doing all sorts of things like that. So Melker Brobeck, the German immigrant, is joining the Light Infantry Company in the 1st Maryland Continental Regiment. This is also the week that Thomas Paine's Common Sense, by the way, is flying out of the bookshelves, flying off the bookshelves, flying out of the booksellers' shops in Philadelphia. They can't keep them in stock, it's so popular, and they've decided, by golly, we need a German language edition of Common Sense. So, if Melker Brobeck gets his hands on it, he'll know how to read it in German or in English, perhaps, as far as that goes. I'm just going a little sidebar here. Melker Brobeck, German immigrant. Thomas Paine, who writes Common Sense, British immigrant. German language edition of Common Sense for the immigrant community. Immigrant. I'm not making a political point from 2026. I'm just pointing out 3 basic facts from 1776, 250 years ago. It's worth noting, I think. Here's our leadership question. Melker Brobeck joins 9th Company in the 1st Maryland. What do you as a leader, what do you need to know, what would you like to know from your newest followers? I wonder what the captain of the company or the colonel of the regiment would most want to know from Private Melker Brobeck. And so for you, what do you need to know from your newest member of your followers, of your team, of your whatever? That's our leadership question. We go to number 2 here. Oh, the train's in town. The train's in town. And that's the artillery train. The artillery train is that 60 tons worth of cannon and cannon equipment that Henry Knox has hauled, dragged, struggled, wrestled, and grappled with to get from Fort Ticonderoga to the Continental Army encampment in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's an amazing feat that George Washington asked him to tackle, and he's accomplished it. And they all arrive this week in the encampment at Cambridge, encircling Boston, which means they've got the resources now to conduct a real siege of the enemy. Didn't have it before. They've got it now. We're going to take some time to unpack, kind of figure it all out, but by gosh, it's a great day. That artillery train of Henry Knox has arrived, and we're just thrilled if you're in Washington's encampment. Washington is just beside himself with happiness at having this new resource. Now, here's my leadership question for you. Henry Knox has pulled this off for you. Let's put you in Washington's shoes here for a second. How do you look at Henry Knox now? If you're the leader, you ask this young person to go do this. By the way, Knox is around 26. If you ask the young person to go do this and they pull it off, how do you look at that person now? I know that's kind of an odd question, maybe, but you give an assignment to a young follower, a young team member, who you think has some potential, but you give them this tough thing to tackle, and they pull it off. How do you look at that person now? Do you immediately think, boy, I gotta promote that individual, or I gotta say good job, or I gotta do whatever it is? How do you look at that person now? Let's go to number 1 on the top 5. And I remember I told you I'd really like you to go to Redux and read that, because there's a lot of good stuff in here. The Continental Congress, 250 years ago now, decides to write a letter to the people of Canada on the heels of this disastrous invasion attempt by the Continental Army that just collapsed, failed, fell apart. The Continental Congress sends a letter to the people of Canada. I'd like to stop and see in a session with you, what would you put in that letter? What they put in the letter is fascinating. They go back and essentially recreate or lay out in a roadmap how they've come to be, how the Continental Congress and the Union has come to be. And they basically ask and invite and encourage the Canadians, we'd like you we'd like you to think about doing this too. That's a really interesting thing. So here's my leadership question for you. How do you explain your team's failure? Whatever that most recent failure has been, how do you and your team explain it to yourselves and to other people? This is what the Continental Congress is doing in their letter. They know it's failed, but here's what they go forth with in their communication. Which takes me then to my big idea. What's the big idea, Dan, from this week? I've been pounding away, and I'll continue to pound away. We were a union first and a nation second. If you want to see Dan says that a lot, but can I get my hands on some evidence, some proof of this? This letter is your proof. They lay out very clearly in this letter their sense of who they are and how they've come to be who they are. So if you want to see how the Union sees itself, read this letter that the Continental Congress writes 250 years ago this week. I'm Dr. Dan Miller. It's been great to hang out. Give me 1 second. I'll take a last sip as you go. Stay warm, and I'll see you next week.